Jordan had been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for more than a decade when he experienced this unimaginable experience that changed his life. He had spent hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours patrolling the park, but had still only touched foot in a small percentage of it. Yellowstone is larger than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware combined, and is over 2.2 million acres. Jordan's days were a blend of routine patrols and managing some of the crazy and unexpected happenings in one of the most geothermally active areas on the planet. One crisp morning, as the sun was just rising, Jordan set out on his usual route near the geothermal zones. The earth here literally seemed to be alive, breathing steam from vents and fissures. For him, it was a constant reminder of the powerful forces at work beneath the surface of the earth. As he made his way through the area, clipboard in hand, something unusual caught his attention. It was a shadowy figure, or so it seemed, moving near one of the larger steam vents. At first, Jordan chalked it up to the way the sun was coming through the misty air, a mirage created by the rising steam in the early morning sun. But as he squinted for a better look, the figure remained there, standing out against the misty backdrop. Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, aware that visitors often wandered off the marked paths, sometimes with dire consequences, Jordan decided to investigate. Approaching the area with caution, the figure became clearer, and Jordan's initial curiosity shifted to confusion. It didn't move like a person. Instead, it seemed almost to hover, its edges blurred by the steam. Telling himself it was likely just an optical illusion, a play of shadows and steam, Jordan nonetheless felt compelled to get closer to it. If there was even the slightest chance someone was in trouble, it was his responsibility to check it out. The terrain grew more challenging as he neared the vent, the ground hot and treacherous beneath his boots. But as he tried to get closer, the figure seemed to drift further away, leading him deeper into the geothermal field. Jordan's sense of unease grew with each step. The park's beauty hid dangers, and every ranger knew stories of those who'd underestimated its power. And then suddenly, the figure vanished. It literally just disappeared before his eyes. And now, Jordan found himself alone in a dense mist, the sound of hissing vents and bubbling springs echoing around him. He realized then that he'd lost sight of the path, and everything seemed so confusing. The landscape, usually so familiar, suddenly felt alien and threatening. He looked around, trying to regain his bearings. His heart racing, Jordan took a moment to gather his thoughts. Panic would only make things worse. He retraced his steps, moving carefully back the way he'd come. But this was the point at which he stumbled upon something truly unexpected. Not a supernatural revelation, but a very real and immediate danger. A new fissure had opened in the ground, not far from the main path, hidden by the steam and easily missed in the shifting light. This was something the park absolutely needed to be aware of, and it was a sobering reminder of how dangerous the area could be, especially to those visitors who don't follow the rules and leave the paths. Jordan marked the location, planning to return with a team to secure the area and warn visitors. The figure he'd seen, he now surmised, was maybe not a trick of light and steam, but something otherworldly. A supernatural being or life force that appeared with the sole purpose of showing him the new danger in the park, almost as if the park itself had sent this life force. Back at the ranger station, Jordan reported his findings, the experience leaving him with a renewed respect for the park's power. The mystery of the figure and what it really was remained in the forefront of his thoughts for many days. But for Jordan, the real revelation was the reminder of nature's unpredictability, the constant need for vigilance in the face of its beauty and dangers. He continued his work with a deeper understanding of the balance between awe and caution, and how important his job was, since he and other rangers are tasked with protecting both the park and those who came to marvel at its wonders. The park, he knew, held many secrets, some revealed by science, others left to the imagination, but all under the watchful eyes of those who knew it best. Let me tell you about Tom, His story's a curveball that you may or may not relate to. He was living in New York City and was a real hotshot in advertising. Then one day he got a huge shocker and ended up in the hospital due to stress. He's lying there in his hospital room, and it's like he's seeing clearly for the first time. Said he realized that his life was all fluff and no substance whatsoever. So he quits, just like that, packs up his fancy suits, leaves his corner office and swaps it all for hiking boots and the Great Smoky Mountains. Got himself a job as a park ranger there. Crazy story, right? But he loves it. Tom says there's something about the trees and the quiet that feels more real than anything he ever experienced in the city. Now he spends his days telling stories about the old folklore and making sure the bears don't get too friendly. He traded skyscrapers for the mountains, and he's never looked back, not even once. Tom's days naturally connected with the Smokies right away, just as if he was part of the mountain mist that rolled over the peaks every morning. Over the years, he'd walked the trails so many times. The crunch of the underbrush was like a second language to him, one that told him exactly which small creatures were scurrying for cover as he walked by. Yet, that evening, the forest was putting out sounds that he couldn't quite recognize. He was making his rounds, checking the campsites as dusk started to fall. The job was second nature to him, a routine that seldom presented surprises. Campers would often try to catch his eye, eager to exchange pleasantries, or lure him into sharing a tale or two of what they had encountered, or asking Tom what he thought of something, or where the best hiking paths were. Tom had a story for everyone, but he never believed the stories of unknown creatures that people would worry about. Soon into his rounds that night, the first rustle came from a cluster of bushes to his right. Tom paused, his hand instinctively going to the flashlight at his belt. Bears were common enough, and he was well versed in the protocol. Make noise, make yourself big, avoid a confrontation. Yet, as he stood there, waiting for the shuffling to reveal a black snout or the glint of curious eyes, there was a silence that felt like it lasted an eternity. Then it moved, not with the lumbering, noisy effort of a bear, but with a hush of leaves that sent a shiver down Tom's spine. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the twilight like a signal flare. What he saw in that moment was etched into his memory, like the grooves in the bark of the ancient trees surrounding him. It was large, much larger than any bear he'd come across, with matted fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its eyes, a piercing silver, met his gaze, and in them, Tom saw a depth of understanding, an intelligence that rooted him to the spot. It stood on two legs, towering over him, its chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Then, the creature stepped back, melting into the thickets as though it had become one with the surrounding foliage. Tom was left with the sounds of the forest. He blinked, wondering if the dimming day had played tricks on his eyes. But no, the forest was too quiet. The usual sounds of nocturnal life stilled, as if in respect of the being that had just passed through. Tom realized he hadn't drawn a breath since the creature appeared, and now his lungs demanded air in heaving gasps. He made his way back to the ranger station, with legs that felt like they were carved from the gnarled roots of the mountain. The words of his encounter sat on his tongue, heavy as stones in a riverbed. How could he tell this story? Would they think he'd finally inhaled too many campfire tales and let his imagination run wild in the solitude of the woods? No, this story was different. It wasn't a tale woven to entertain or to teach a moral wrapped in the cloak of a bedtime fable. This was real as the dirt beneath his feet and the stars that were now peeking through the fabric of the night sky. Tom understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of a story that isn't sure if it wants to be told, of a truth that might unravel the stitches of the world you thought you knew. He could share this, cast it into the sea of stories that flowed around the campfires, and let it become just another legend of the Smokies. Or he could keep it close, a secret communion between him and the woods. Either way, Tom knew the forest had changed for him. He had become a part of its lore, a living chapter in the ongoing tale that the Smokies would whisper to those who walked its paths, searching for mysteries in the embrace of the ancient hills. It was the kind of summer in Banff National Park where the days were slow and steady and blending into one another, each so similar to the last that everything was starting to feel routine. It was 1995, and Jack, a ranger in the park with a wiry frame and eyes that missed nothing, was looking for something to spark some excitement. He was hoping to get his patrols switched up to an area new to him, an area in a more remote part of the park. He'd taken up the role of a ranger out of a love for the stillness of the forest and a need to be away from the ordinary. The backcountry trails were his sanctuary, a place where things changed all the time, and he didn't know what would be around the next corner. Eventually that summer, something shifted, and the sanctuary began to whisper secrets. It started subtly enough. On his rounds, he started to notice marks on the trees. Not the usual territorial scratches left by bears, but something else, something deliberate. They were too uniform, too rhythmic, as if conveying a message. If only he could figure it out. Jack pondered over these curious symbols, tracing his fingers over the grooves, feeling the roughness of the bark. The night in question brought with it a chill that seemed out of place in the heart of summer. Jack sat in his cabin, poring over old books and maps by the light of a flickering lantern, trying to find any mention of the marks. The only sound was the soft ticking of an old clock, until a howl shattered the silence. It was a sound that seemed to come from another world, deep and resonant, unlike any animal Jack knew. It was a sound that seeped into his bones. The next day, under a gray sky, Jack set out to patrol the trails, his mind replaying the howl. It was as if the forest knew something was wrong because the usual chatter of wildlife was eerily absent. He walked, his steps measured and purposeful, though he could not shake the feeling of being watched. But no matter how many times he spun around quickly, trying to find a culprit, he found nothing. He spent hours patrolling and looking around, trying to find anything out of place or that needed his attention. He even took to using his binoculars to see if he could find anything wrong off in the distance. That's when he saw it. Up on a ridge, a figure stood in stark contrast against the sky. Tall and upright, it was motionless, silhouetted like a watchtower looking over the land. Its fur, visible even from a distance, bristled in the wind, and for a moment, Jack convinced himself it was just a bear or a large dog. But then it moved with a disturbingly human-like gait, pausing to scan the horizon. Jack edged closer, heart thudding with a mix of fear and curiosity, and he could now see the creature in astonishing clarity. Its fur was strands of deep brown intertwined with flecks of black and gray, thick and matted as if it had lived a hard life. The fur seemed to ripple with every movement. Muscles rolled beneath the pelt when it moved. It had powerful limbs ending in hands or paws that blurred the line between man and beast, each finger tipped with a nail that was more akin to a claw, honed by survival, by nights spent in the unforgiving wilderness. The face of the creature was haunting, a look that could only belong to the infamous Sasquatch creature of legend. Its eyes were deep set, reflecting a wisdom that came from a lifetime spent in the woods. Those eyes, an intense shade of amber, flickered with a crystal-clear sharpness. The brow was pronounced, shadowing the eyes, while the jaw was set strong, covered in a thicker patch of fur that hinted at an ability to endure the harshest of winters. The nose was broad and flat, flaring slightly as it took in the sense of its domain, and its mouth, though obscured by the overgrowth of hair, seemed capable of articulating sounds far beyond the range of any known wildlife. The Sasquatch's head sat atop a neck that was almost non-existent, giving it a stoic and formidable presence. It stood there, a creature of myth right there in the flesh, and in that moment, Jack knew he was witnessing a living legend, a being as much a part of the land as the rocks and rivers. This was no fleeting glimpse into the paranormal. It was a profound encounter with a being that defied explanation, a reminder of how vast and full of wonder the world truly was. The creature's gaze met Jack's, and in that instant, the ranger felt a strong and uncontrollable fear clutch at his chest. It was the kind of fear when you realize that man is not the apex predator. They stood there, man and beast, the air between them charged with an electric current. Then, with a snarl that seemed to twist the very air, the creature lunged. Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding. He watched in horror as the creature moved with a predatory grace, its limbs contorting in ways that seemed to defy nature. The encounter was brief, a mere handful of seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Jack. The creature leapt past him without touching him, disappearing into the forest, leaving behind a trail of disturbed leaves and a ranger whose view of the world had been irrevocably changed. Jack returned to town with a story no one would believe, a tale of a creature that walked like a man but was as wild as the park. It was a tale that would follow him, a memory now etched into his being. And while life in the park returned to its sleepy rhythm, Jack knew that somewhere out there, the creature roamed free, guarding secrets that man was not meant to know. It was an experience that would stay with him forever, and a story that would sometimes drift through his dreams, but still as elusive as the howl that had first shattered the stillness of his backcountry haven. He's keeping his eyes peeled, but as of yet, nothing. Ask anyone who walked the neighborhood back in the day. We all knew about the cat lady. I'm going to keep her name and address out of this story, but you can imagine the kind of person I'm talking about pretty easily. Middle child, grew up alone, never really settled down. Hair got gray and the cats moved in. You can imagine the house too. Cleaned once a year and only in the spring. Run by a feline matriarchy the rest of the time. Ask anyone who walked the neighborhood back in the day. No one knew what happened to the cat lady. No one who wanted to talk about it anyway. And I guess no one in the right mind really would want to talk about it. Maybe that's the real point of this story. Maybe I'm not in my right mind anymore. It was years ago now, a whole generation ago practically. I was driving the neighborhood alone in my patrol car. It was a quiet area. I was real grateful for that throughout my career. Never fired my weapon. I was grateful for that too. But if we're talking about the cat lady, we're talking about the time I came closest to pulling the trigger. No one had seen her in a while. They'd only seen her cats, split into two brooding factions amidst her unexplained disappearance. Half of them scratched at her front door, seeking a dim reprieve from the scalding summer heat. The other half stared out from her windows, wide-eyed and meowing at anyone who stopped to listen. It was probably the cats that made the neighbors so nervous. Those cats were the whole reason I even got the call for the wellness check. Now you get it, don't you? I'm uniquely qualified to tell this story because I'm the one who found her. There are only a few people who saw what really happened that day. The rest of them are still gainfully employed, and thereby I predict a little more tight-lipped than I've become in my old age. Their careers as paramedics lasted longer than my career as an officer of the law, apparently. Anyway, the visit started routine-like. I knocked, I called out. No response, predictably. I called for medical support. I could already smell the answer to the most important question. What had happened here? I checked tentatively if the door was open. It was. Swung loosely from my hands. I had to lift my feet to clear a path for the tides of cats that ran in and out from the entryway. The factions were swapping sides, I guess. Each one had convinced themselves that the other group had it better. They hadn't yet discovered that in this situation, everyone got the short end of the stick. I called animal control too. Then I went inside. I'd already painted the scene in my mind. I'd find the cat lady in her bed, I told myself. There'd be a few days worth of decomposition, but she'd still be recognizable for what she had been. I held my breath and tried not to choke on the acidic sting that hammered its way into my nostrils. My eyes were watering. I was already getting nauseous. I called out again just in case. When I heard something move, something heavier than a cat, I stopped. Hello? I announced myself yet again. Another shift of weight came from somewhere in the belly of the house. I heard something thud against the wall. I moved quicker, suddenly aware that I might have misread the situation entirely. I was in such a hurry that I forgot to call for more backup. Whatever it was, danger was the furthest thing from my mind. I pushed my way into the house, nudged a few of the frantic cats aside, and finally arrived at what I expected was the bedroom door. The shuffling sound was coming from the other side. I could hear someone groaning. Yet again, the handle was unlocked. This time, as I twisted it, I held the door firmly shut. If it was the cat lady on the other side, couldn't she have let herself out? If it wasn't the cat lady at all, what was I prepared to do? Could it have been an intruder? I unlatched the safety strap from my gun's holster, but didn't draw the weapon. I slowly slid the door open and let it reveal the mystery inside. A few days of decomposition had been generous. It looked like the cat lady had been in there for a week or more. I'll save the details for another time. You don't have the stomach for what I saw, trust me. I didn't either. My lunch hit the floor. The cats scurried to investigate. I didn't have time to shoo them away, not in that moment. I still had to figure out why and how the cat lady was on her feet. She shifted and shambled, turning around in an odd jerky motion until finally we were facing each other. I heard the paramedics at the front door. They were stepping through the threshold, hurrying my way. I don't remember pulling my firearm from its holster, but suddenly it was there in my hands. I was pointing it at her, the shambling human-like shape that wanted to step toward me. It lifted its leg in vain. It stumbled, nearly fell. As the visage of the woman adjusted its weight, the paramedics arrived at my side. I know they were opening their mouths to begin the routine rounds of questions and commands. They were expecting to take control of the scene. They weren't expecting whatever she was. Then she fell. Just like that, one of her knees gave out and she fell face first onto the hardwood floor. It sounded like a bag of tomatoes had been dropped on the pavement, ruptured, exploded. I backpedaled out of the house as the paramedics continued onward. They were stronger than me. Maybe that's the reason they're not the ones telling this story. Maybe they found their own ways to explain it. But I haven't. Not yet. I stood on that porch, staring at the gun in my trembling hands. I don't know what she had become or even how it had happened. I only knew that I'd come close to making a mistake, and I carried that. Ask anyone, I was good at my job. I was, but it all fell apart after her. Some stories about my time in Iraq can only be told in broad stories. I can't get too specific, can't give too many details. If it was only my rear end that was on the line, maybe it would be different. But there are people from that time of my life that don't deserve the trouble that transparency would bring them. So for now, broad stories will have to do. It was 2004. It was the middle of November, but the temperature's still in the 80s. It took me a while to get used to that, trust me. Growing up in the heartland gives you certain expectations for the seasons. Where I was stationed, the seasons didn't make much sense to me. Nothing did in that desert. I guess that's what made this story possible in the first place. Life was already unbelievable. So, is what I'm about to tell you really that weird? I was left alone at our base. That didn't happen often, like ever. But we were called away en masse to support a nearby transport that had encountered an IED. My group happened to be the closest capable fighters, and so we were the ones asked to secure a perimeter around the convoy, to escort them to whatever oasis they were looking for. I, however, had just broken my hand the night before. It didn't seem major, and I wasn't looking for an excuse to go home, but that didn't stop the grunt of disapproval or the order for me to stay behind and hold our location. So I did. I spent most of the day trying to ignore my injuries. I knew medical was going to assess the wound when my group returned from their mission, and I didn't want to get kicked out of the desert like some broken toy. I could still fight. I just couldn't let them know how badly my hand was hurting. Eventually, night came and the moon followed. Our base was erected in these bombed-out ruins. In a firefight, the remains would have given us a decent amount of cover. Not that a firefight was coming, of course. The conflict had moved on long before we settled in. We were only still in the area to ensure a third party didn't reclaim it and open up one of our flanks. Anyway, I was back holding the location and combing through the terrain like a hog hunting for truffles. Out of nowhere, I catch this low growl. In hindsight, it was straight out of a B-movie. Weird and unlike anything I'd ever heard, almost comically timed. In the moment, however, it was terrifying. I hug what's left of a wall, gripping my rifle like it's my ticket back home. Sand crunches under unseen footsteps, and I'm thinking, this can't be real. Then, boom, this creature appears. Half man, half wolf, like someone played Dr. Frankenstein in the desert. Fur blended with the darkness, eyes locked on me. It's a standoff. Both me and the creature knows what comes next. I know I can't afford to be slow on the draw. I start shooting and this thing's dodging bullets, like it's been trained by the government. And it's circling me like I'm its next meal ticket. The howls kick in, echoing through the ruins, and I'm stuck in a showdown with what looks like a freaking wolf man. It's like the desert threw me some supernatural being to keep things interesting. Just my luck, right? I'm pulling the trigger and shooting at shadows. The monster's a blur, disappearing and reappearing like a ghost. I'm questioning my sanity. Is this some PTSD-induced hallucination or a legit desert monster? The wolfman creature locks eyes with me again, and I swear it knows more about this crazy world than I do. Then it pounces, and I'm backpedaling like a scared cat, firing off rounds like my life depends on it. 'Cause, well, it does. Wolfman circling again. I don't know how I kept missing, you know? It was like the thing had plot armor. It was just meant to survive. Something in the fabric of this world was willing it to survive, willing my bullets to hit nothing but stone and sand. And just like that, it vanishes into thin air, leaving me standing there, rifle in hand, feeling like I just survived a bad acid trip. I shake off the weirdness and try to resume patrol. That's what you do when things get weird, right? You sink back into routines, habit. I tried to, but couldn't. The nearby sounds of gunfire pulled me back into reality. Maybe the wolfman was just a mirage, a side effect of sleep deprivation and too many MREs. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that I stumbled onto something bigger, like the desert's got more secrets than a politician's closet. And either way, that gunfire's real. I'm navigating this war-torn maze, and the wind carries the stench of the burnt-out building. I push forward, wondering if the wolfman was just the tip of the iceberg. And then, the distant gunfire turns into a full-blown battle. I follow the chaos like a moth to a flame. 'Cause who needs self-preservation, right? That's the first thing they drill out of you. I hit a clearing, and there they are. The wolfman and some soldier, going at it like it's a wrestling match in the desert. I pause for a sec, taking in the surreal scene. The soldier's scrapping like he's in a back alley brawl. And I figure, why not? He's one of our own. Can't leave him to his own devices. We start unloading on the wolfman together, bullets flying like it owes us money. The soldier catches my eye, and in that split second, we share this unspoken bond. Yeah, we're dealing with some kind of freak show, but we got each other's backs. It's crazy how quickly you're willing to lay down your life for somebody wearing the same uniform as you. The moon's hanging low, casting long shadows, and we're going at it. Shots ringing out. The aroma of gunpowder and fur fills my lungs. I can taste blood in my mouth from clenching my teeth so hard. Somehow, we land a hit. The thing yelps like a dog. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't a cry of pain. I was expecting a second half to the boss fight, you know? But we hit it and it runs. It disappears, is more like it. Fades into the same shadows we were filling with bullets. The soldier nods. Guess they were sent back my way from the site of the convoy. Moving ahead of the rest of the group, supposed to tell me to pack up and get ready to join the others. Didn't make much sense, I know. But after the encounter, I wasn't about to ask any questions. We packed up, joined the convoy, and followed them across the desert. The guy I met, the one who helped me fight the creature, warned me not to tell the others. Told me that they wouldn't believe us. They'd send us home and commit us to a lifetime of visits to the VA. I kept quiet until the conflict ended. Now I look back and can't help but question the timing of it all. The convoy gets stranded on the same night that I encountered the beast. This lone soldier just happens upon me in the middle of that fight, and we're ordered to follow them, to abandon our post, to keep them safe, not knowing what they were transporting or why, where they were going, or what they would be doing there. But those questions don't fit in with the broad stories, do they? This is where the story has to end, because my life depends on that. I've been a bank teller for most of my adult life. I had a stint in the fast food industry, but it didn't stick, thankfully. That isn't to say that my current job is a glamorous one, though. Most days, working at the bank is as routine as any other public-facing job. And notice that I said, most days. I don't want to talk about most days, though. I want to tell you about one day in specific, though. So, here goes. There's one day that has kind of followed me. Even after changing branches and moving to a new bank altogether, I can't quite wipe this particular day from my mind. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to. Maybe there was a point to it. But maybe not. It was a Thursday. I remember how badly we were all looking forward to the weekend. That's my favorite part of the job, I think. Our schedule doesn't change much. The same routine that sometimes gets boring also offers us the luxury of knowing exactly when we'll be off. Weekends, holidays. You get it, right? The lobby is pretty alive with our enthusiasm. We haven't seen many clients, aside from one or two local businesses coming in to make their regular deposits. Slow days are usually our favorite. You spend Monday through Friday with the same crowd, and you can't help but feel like family. The youngest family member, or in this case, the newest member of the branch, is often the one who gets stuck with the random walk-ins. You might be able to guess it. On this specific Thursday, I drew the unlucky short straw. I was the person behind the desk when the man in the black hat walked in. It was midsummer. I didn't think anything of how ill-fitted his suit was, or how wide that aforementioned hat seemed to be. Maybe he had a job interview, I thought. He was borrowing a suit from one of his uncles. Maybe he even got the job, so he needed to come open an account to set up direct deposit. I gave him the usual greeting and smile, waiting for him to approach from the sliding glass doors. When he walked, it was with an almost robotic jerking motion. It was like he had to remember how to move, like the signal between his brain and his body was delayed somehow. His eyes and his expression told me, hello. They told me everything was fine and normal, but he moved like his bones didn't quite line up. I stayed polite. I asked him what sort of business he had with our bank. My eyes briefly dropped to my computer screen as he arrived at the opposite side of the counter. When I looked up and met his gaze, my skin all but crawled off my body. His expression was still fine. It was perfectly normal. If it had been a photograph anyway. It was still. It was perfectly still. His eyes didn't move, not an inch. His smile didn't waver, didn't quiver or shift. His brow stayed high and animated. His pale face might as well have been a mask. When he didn't answer, I repeated my question. He told me he had 4 questions about the bank. And yes, I answered them. 1. What separated us from other local options? 2. How long had we been around? 3. How long had I been working with the company? 4. How was I enjoying it? The questions became more and more personal. Although I could feel the goose flesh popping up on my arms and neck, I couldn't stop myself from answering. I was trapped in that cycle of politeness, and I had been sucked in with the easy first questions. My eyes darted around the lobby, searching for a coworker that might bail me out of the awkward conversation. They saw me. They saw my eyes pleading for help, but they also saw the man in the black hat. They saw the way his jaw moved up and down like it was operated by a lever, like he was a puppet instead of a person. It must have made them sick, sicker even than I was feeling. They all turned away. Some of them headed for the break room, others for the restroom or the offices. That was the final thing he said to me. He thanked me for answering his questions and said that he'd be back. He'd be back to open an account with me, he promised. He'd be back because he liked me so much. He liked what I had to say, and he liked the way I said it. When I shook my head and tried to ask a question of my own, the figure turned away. He walked erratically from the counter and headed for the door yet again. I opened my mouth to call after him but stopped. Something about the conversation made me feel violated. It made me feel like I'd been taken advantage of. I had, however briefly, been something for the man to prod and gawk at. That wasn't my job, I didn't appreciate that. But then I saw that he wasn't alone. There was another man outside, standing on the opposite side of the glass doors, looking in with eyes so wide that they looked like circles. He was dressed the same as the man I helped. His smile was the same, sick and plastic. He wasn't watching his friend retreat. He wasn't having a cigarette or pacing the sidewalk, waiting for his companion to return. He was just staring at me. I stared back. Then they were together outside, and the first man slapped the second on his shoulder. They opened their mouths as if to laugh, but I didn't hear anything. I don't think they made a sound, actually. I was mostly relieved that they finally, together, turned their backs on me. I shrank behind the counter as they walked away. I didn't realize it, but I'd been holding my breath. It took me a while to compose myself. I felt jet-lagged or turned around somehow. But they never came back. Or maybe they haven't come back yet. But I would hate to think it's the latter. Like I said, I've changed branches. I've changed companies. I've moved to a new town, and I help an entirely new group of people. But still, I can't help remember. He said he'd be back. The man in the black hat said he liked me. And that, my friends, still haunts my dreams. A lot of silly questions come up when I tell people I had a horse. I guess I don't look that type anymore. I'm now about 30 years removed from any decent form of riding, so I guess I've earned all the skeptical looks and the eager questions to try and understand. Yes, the horse was mine. I had the papers to prove it then, and I have the memories to prove it now. He was a quarter horse, and he was really good in a jam. Took some urging on long rides, but so did I back then. I like being alone out in the desert, but it only takes a few days for the loneliness to creep in. Maybe cell towers have changed that now. His name was Shotgun. Called him that for the way he could break into a sprint, tear across the earth in any direction you could point him, get in the way of Shotgun and where he was going, and well, you might just get run down. This story isn't just about Shotgun, though. It's also about what I used to do for work. It's about me, I guess. It's about the thing my horse and I encountered out in New Mexico. I think it was 93, maybe 92. That part gets blurry, so you'll have to forgive me. I think Clinton was in office. Anyway, I worked the ranches out there. Miles and miles of untamed land, owned and maintained just for the health of the herds. Horses and sheep and cattle. There were a lot of different herds out there. The family I worked for at the time were into cattle, dairy. Takes a lot of earth to provide for a cow. Takes even more earth to provide for the kind of cows it takes to make a decent living. They were carving one out though, so I was going to do it too. Shotgun and I were hired on to patrol the area, mend fences, scare away the occasional coyote, hunt down any strays that got separated from the pack. It was a pretty job. It was quiet. Most of the time it was uneventful. I got a lot of thinking done back then, most of it from horseback and the rest of it with my back on the ground. I slept out there. Can you believe that? At least we did until Shotgun and I found that thing out in the desert. The family's cattle were turning up injured. They were disappearing from the herd more frequently than usual, and when they came back around, it was always with a strange wound on their necks. 3 points, like a triangle, scabbed over with blood always. The cows were anemic too. That's what it's called when you're low on blood, right? Whatever it's called, that's what they were, sluggish and weak. Took a lot of work to get their strength back. Some never recovered to their former selves. Whatever was causing it, I got asked to hunt it down. That didn't seem so hard. Whether it was a bat of some kind, I'd heard that those vampire bats are a real thing, or whether it was a rival rancher trying to cause problems, Shotgun and I could fix it. We let a bull run off, then followed him instead of rounding him up. We used him as bait. Yep, we did. Kept his trail until the sun went down and he got tired. We watched him graze. We watched him drift asleep. I think Shotgun nodded off too, but he'd earned it after lugging me around all day. I kept watch. I got to see the thing approach. It was flitting among the rocks at first, trying to stay out of sight. It was circling the young cow. I thought at first it was scared. A fox maybe. Definitely not the culprit I was expecting. But then I got to thinking. Its movements were purposeful, and sure enough, it had circled the bull until it was approaching from downwind. Kept its scent out of the bull's nostrils. Smart fella. I had a rifle with me. I was a terrible shot, but I figured I'd need it to swing around. If I ran into any coyotes, I might need to deter one of them. If I ran into any people, well, there was a chance they'd need scared off too. I lined up the rifle and watched the creature advance from down the length of the barrel. Its arms were too long to be canine. They didn't bend the right way either. They looked, truthfully, like 4 human arms doing their best to mimic the movements of an animal. It turned my stomach just looking at it, watching its feet slap the earth like an open hand. Its body was canine though. That at least made sense. A ridge of fur ran down its spine while the rest of its skin was bare and blistered. I wished for a moment that the sun was still out. I wished for a better view than what the moon could give me, but then again, maybe the lack of real detail was merciful. Maybe I didn't want to see that creature in all of its glory. It closed in on the bull, and I heard a click echo across the terrain. It was wet and dull like a bone breaking. The thing, I realized, was unhinging its jaw. A long tube-like tongue started to slither out of the creature's gaping mouth. It inched toward the neck of the sleeping bull. I couldn't let it feed. That would defeat the point, wouldn't it? I didn't want to see the thing anymore either. I wanted it dealt with. I wanted it gone. So I pulled the trigger and sunk that bullet into the earth by the monster's feet. It yowled, startled, and cackled in a way that I think hyenas laugh. It searched for me in the darkness. I was too far away for it to spot, thankfully, so I fired again before leaping to my feet. I couldn't stick around. Shotgun was wide awake at this point, and he was ready to go, earning his name, remember? I grabbed his reins and tried to calm him, only briefly looking over my shoulder to make sure the creature had run. It was gone, all right. No sight of the thing at all. It was gone, and we were lucky, because it stayed gone too. Didn't see it for the rest of my time there. Didn't sleep outside anymore either. The encounter, for me, faded back into a memory. It became a little bit less important in the grand scheme of things. Life is full of so much weird, you know? It didn't fade for Shotgun, unfortunately. He stayed skittish after that. Didn't want anything to do with the desert or the ranch or even with me. I retired that old boy and let him live out his days somewhere pleasant. Somewhere I knew that thing wouldn't come for him. That's the story. Maybe it's silly in its own right, but I don't know. What do you think? I'm not a believer in any of the hokey stuff. You can send me all of the evidence and theories and unexplained events that you like. I don't bite, never have, and I think, for the most part, I never will. I have to leave those words "I think" in there, for the most part, because I have encountered something really strange. I've seen something that I haven't been able to explain or identify. Maybe that makes me a hypocrite. Maybe it makes me a liar. All I can really do is tell you what happened and let you decide for yourself. I frequent Colorado pretty regularly. My family owns a condo out there. We vacation at the base of the mountain once a year or so. The rest of the year, we rent it out. Airbnb has made the whole process pretty easy. Anyway, we used to use that condo for family trips. We all traveled together and went skiing when the weather permitted. As we all grew up and grew distant, we started visiting the condo at different times. It became a little escape for each of us. Whenever the real world got too overwhelming, we could pull the Colorado seal, and our vacation would inflate. I was there solo a few years ago now, hiking alone in the snowy season, which wasn't too out of character for me. I stuck to the tourist-friendly trails, even though I felt I'd been there enough to no longer be considered a tourist. The cloud coverage was pretty intense, even though the snowfall was limited. The overcast weather ensured that I had much of the mountain to myself. Humans were few and far between, at least. It got colder and more gray the further you went up, and that just wasn't the experience people were looking for. I was hunting down a bit of peace, I guess. I thought the clear air might clear my mind. That was ridiculous thought in hindsight. I couldn't have been prepared for what I was going to discover. I slipped as I approached the summit, sprained my ankle. Rookie move, I know, but it happens. It wasn't so bad that I was immobile, but I did end up sitting in the snow for a while, trying to rest my leg. 20 minutes, I told myself. 20 minutes of rest and then I'd head back down. I faced the slope of the mountain, overlooked the town. I could even see the building where my condo was located. My car was a little speck in the parking lot. I climbed high enough, I gathered. Even though my ankle was throbbing, I was able to take a deep breath and, sure enough, I felt better. Then something hit the ground beside me, sunk into the snow, leaving a little indentation where it had disappeared and been swiftly reburied. What was that? Before I could look over my shoulder, a white clump crashed into the powdery surface, disappeared like the one before it. Was it a snowball? My siblings and I had teased each other in similar ways. I caught myself laughing under my breath as I turned around. I was already explaining. I thought I was alone up here. I expected to see a family, maybe the kid responsible for tossing snowballs at my back. But no one was there. Hello? My voice drifted across the snow like the breeze. No response came back. Then another icy ball came sailing toward me. I had to duck this one. I hit the ground and gasped, spitting the snow out of my mouth and trying to look up from my newly prone position. Further up the mountain, further up than I could have expected, was a single humanoid shape. It had to have been 60 yards away. It didn't make sense. The gray shape was just standing there. Unless it was a quarterback dressed in Arctic camo, I was looking at someone who was terribly out of place. I warned them to knock it off and pulled myself upright yet again. They weren't throwing things anymore. Now they were moving toward me, running, sprinting. What I had mistaken for gray clothing was swaying each time their feet dug into the ground. It moved like hair. It moved like fur was covering their body from head to toe. And it was. As they closed in on my position, the dim, overcast light revealed their expression. They were scowling, lips curled, fangs revealed. Nostrils flared and square-like brow tensed. It wasn't a person at all. It moved like a man, but it was clearly something more primitive, taller, heavier. I turned and ran. I fell, scrambled, and ran some more. I ignored the burning in my ankle and did my best to plummet down the mountain with some semblance of control. I would have rolled head over heels if it meant escaping that thing. Whatever it was, I knew that it was chasing me. I knew that it wanted me off of the mountain, and I didn't want to imagine what would happen if it finally caught up. How far could it throw me, I wondered. I heard someone shouting and I turned toward the voice. I spotted a pair of snowboarders on a nearby ridge and turned to meet them. I practically collapsed into their arms. When they asked, I pointed. I tried to pick out the shape of the monster in the distance, but it was too hard to see. It was blending in yet again. It had disappeared in the snow, or maybe even turned back. They moved forward to look for it, to explain away my exaggerated claims. I pulled them back. They must have seen the severity in my eyes, because they gave up on tracking down the creature. They helped me back to safety. I filed a report and retreated to my condo, equipped with a hot bowl of soup and enough whiskey to make me forget the day. I'm still not a believer, but maybe that's because I don't know what I saw. Until I know what that thing was, how can I know whether or not I believe in it? Maybe it was just a trick of the Colorado snow. But then again, maybe not. The autumn air bit into my skin as I trudged through the dense woods of Pine Ridge National Park. I was never smart enough to dress for the weather, but that became the least of my worries very quickly. At the time, I was working as a travel writer, always on the lookout for the next thrilling place to write about. Little did I know that this journey would take me into the heart of darkness. I know, that's a bit dramatic sounding, isn't it? I guess I was just scared out of my wits, but you can call it whatever you like. I had heard rumors about mysterious sightings in these woods, whispers of creatures lurking in the shadows, creatures that defied explanation. Intrigued, I decided to investigate, thinking it would make for a fascinating piece. Armed with my camera, notepad, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I set out. The trees stood tall, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. There I go again, huh? Being dramatic. I guess it's a habit of mine, considering my line of work. The pay was always better if my piece had a little flourish. I'll try to minimize it for the sake of legitimacy. But where was I thought. The silence around me was broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. As I pushed deeper, the air grew heavy with a stillness that had me looking over my shoulder. like when it's too quiet and you know something is wrong. I eventually stumbled upon a clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. Nestled among the ancient trees was a structure unlike anything I had ever seen, a makeshift nest, woven together with branches and leaves. My heart raced as I approached cautiously, my camera ready to capture the bizarre scene. It felt like I'd come across an episode of Survivor. Somebody was living out there clearly. My lens focused on the nest, and I marveled at the intricate craftsmanship. It was both primitive and sophisticated, a testament to the intelligence behind its creation. As I snapped photos, an unsettling feeling boiled in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a story about strange sightings. It was a descent into something totally unknown. The rustling of leaves behind me shattered the silence. I spun around, my eyes scanning the shadows. A guttural growl echoed through the trees, rooting me in place. My breath caught as I saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, towering and covered in fur. The legends were true. There was something weird out here after all, and it wasn't alone. A whole family of them, standing before me like ancient guardians of the forest. My mind went to druids and shamans, words that felt like fantasy to someone living in the modern day. What I was looking at, after all, wasn't entirely human. They were shaped like men, sure, but they were double the stature of anyone I'd seen, covered in fur instead of clothes, fur that probably kept them safe from the same air that had chilled me to my bone. It was easier to imagine them as something that had stepped from the pages of a book, inserting them into my reality, into the real world. It was impossible. Panic set in, but curiosity held its ground. I dared to take a step closer, my camera still hanging from my neck. They observed me with eyes that seemed to hold a strange intelligence, a wisdom beyond my understanding. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, to escape the clutches of the forest, but my journalist's curiosity pushed me forward. I edged closer to the nest, my eyes fixed on the creatures. They communicated in low, rumbling tones, a language I couldn't comprehend. When they all turned their eyes on me, gnashing their teeth and barking, I fled. I fled without so much as a picture to prove what I'd seen. But I wasn't running home. I was just running. As I delved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches forming a claustrophobic canopy. A sudden snap echoed through the silence, and I whipped around to see the creatures advancing towards me. Panic gripped my chest as I turned and sprinted through the maze of trees. The once familiar woods had transformed into a labyrinth of terror. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The creatures pursued me with an otherworldly speed, their guttural growls reverberating through the darkness. I could feel their hot breath on my neck, and terror fueled my desperate escape. The trees blurred around me as I raced towards the edge of the forest. My lungs burned and my legs threatened to give way, but I couldn't stop. The creatures were relentless, shadows in pursuit, closing the gap with each passing moment. Finally, I burst through the trees into the blinding light of civilization, a road. Gasping for air, I glanced back, half expecting the creatures to follow. The forest stood silent, concealing its secrets once more. As I stumbled away from Pine Ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed something beyond the realm of human understanding. What had I come across? Was it a loving family out there, or a pack of wild animals? What would they have done if they caught up to me? They were each so massive that it's hard to imagine any type of kindness existing between them and me. It's easier to imagine myself being squished. I survived the encounter, sure, but the chilling memory of those creatures lingered. It was a reminder that in the heart of the wilderness, ancient mysteries still thrived, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to venture into the unknown. Brave or foolish, maybe. I like to think I would have gone either way, investigated with even more tenacity if I had known what was living in there. But I sure haven't gone back. I learned my lesson. I can write plenty of captivating stories without stepping into the den of another monster. I never liked driving in the rain. From the day I started driving, it just put me on edge. I would be leaning forward in my seat, white-knuckling the steering wheel, And then, 10 years ago, something happened that only made it worse. 10 years ago was the time when my son was born. In fact, we just celebrated his birthday last week. Of course, most people say that the day their child is born is pretty unforgettable. Well, mine was too, but I think I've got everyone else beat. I don't think I could forget that day at all, even if I wanted to. I certainly don't want to forget it. But the magic of that day wasn't limited to the hospital room. For me, it started on the drive there. The raindrops were like a drumbeat on the windshield urging me on. My thoughts raced too. Living out in the middle of nowhere came with its perks, but that night I felt at odds with the countryside. First of all, the hospital my wife was at was a 30-minute drive. She had gone into labor while at work and had been driven there by a coworker. The relentless rain had transformed the road into a reflective surface. The dim glow of the moon and sharp yellow of my headlights were distorted by the puddles. I kept looking at the clock on the dashboard. Time seemed to be moving slowly, and it felt like I'd never get there. The phone buzzed intermittently, messages from my wife becoming increasingly urgent. I could sense her panic through the text messages, wanting me to get there. As I rounded a bend, the radio crackled with static, briefly interrupting the low hum of the tires on the pavement. I clenched my jaw and frustration bubbling within me. The last thing I needed was more obstacles on this harrowing journey. The static quickly subsided, replaced by the calm voice of the radio host narrating a mundane weather update. But then, just as quickly as the radio resumed, the night sky erupted in a blaze of blinding light. My eyes widened as I squinted through the rain-smeared windshield, desperately trying to make sense of the surreal lights in the sky. It lasted too long to be lightning, and they were the wrong color for fire. No, this was different. Hovering above the tree line, I then was able to make out a glowing, otherworldly object. A disc-shaped vehicle of some kind. My heart raced and I questioned my stressed mind, wondering if the night had finally pushed me over the edge. It must have been a hallucination, I thought. The car slowed involuntarily as my eyes remained fixed on the shape in the sky. The once familiar grind of tires against wet asphalt faded into the background as the glowing lights captured my full attention. Then, the car engine died. Fear gripped me. My foot hovered above the brake pedal, and I watched the object as it seemed to dance in the stormy sky. If time was blurry before, it was even worse now. My phone buzzed again, startling me back to the urgency of the moment. My wife's messages pleaded for an update. I shook my head, tearing my gaze away from the metal object, and I refocused on the road ahead. I yelled at myself and turned the key. I prayed aloud, hoping it would start up. I pumped the gas pedal and punched the steering wheel, and just when I was about to give up, the car started again. As if the universe conspired against me, the rain intensified, reducing road ahead. The UFO's glow dimmed and eventually disappeared, but its presence lingered in my mind. I willed myself to focus and push forward, to overcome the bizarre encounter and reach the hospital before it was too late. The road seemed to be endless at this point. Each mile felt like the last miles of a marathon. Eventually, the hospital signs appeared. I pushed the accelerator to its limit, the engine roaring in protest. Finally, I skidded into the hospital parking lot, the tires leaving streaks of water in my wake. I practically leaped from the car, stumbling in my haste to reach the entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the sterile scent of antiseptic rushed into my nose. A receptionist directed me to the maternity ward, and I sprinted down the corridor. As I approached the room, the loud squeaking of my sneakers was replaced by the echo of a baby's cries. Dread pooled in my stomach, and I hesitated outside the door. The nurse inside looked up, a mix of sympathy and understanding in her eyes. I had missed the birth. The moment was gone. A surge of emotions overwhelmed me. Guilt, regret, and anger. Had I really let some hallucination spoil this day for me? Had I really let myself be so transfixed? I entered the room where my wife lay, cradling our newborn in their arms. Her eyes, tired but filled with joy, met mine. The baby, wrapped snugly in a blanket, was a tiny, precious miracle. I approached the bedside, my fingers gently brushing against the soft skin of our newborn. Tears welled up in my eyes. Tears of regret, but also tears of overwhelming love for the family that was just beginning. That's what it's all about, right? The things we can hold and touch and love. As we settled into the quiet moments of bonding, the memory of my strange sighting lingered in my mind. A strange mix of awe and frustration swirled within me. The sky had thrown me a supernatural detour. Did it know it was becoming part of such an important day? Was it a blessing of some kind, or an omen? I try not to think about the object itself anymore. I'm much more enamored by my family. I do, however, still think about the rain. And when it pours too hard, I try not to get behind the wheel, because that just doesn't seem to work out well for me. Next up is a story sent in by a guy I'll call John, who was living in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains in West Virginia when this all went down. So, be sure you're ready to hear John's story, because I still get the creeps every time I think about it, and I think you will too. Here's what John had to say. It happened back when I was just a kid, living in a quiet little town nestled between two hills in West Virginia. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the most exciting thing that ever happened was the yearly town fair. It isn't important to the story, but the town fair was never even hosted within the town. You had to drive to get there, and that helps you understand the kind of place I lived. Back to the story though. I had this dog named Max, a scruffy little mutt with a heart as big as his bark. He was my partner in crime, my loyal companion, and we did everything together. One summer night, the sun sinking low in the sky, Max and I decided to take a walk in the woods behind my house. I remember vividly that the trees were casting long shadows, because they were scaring the crap out of me that night. When you're young, even the scary things feel like adventure, don't they? There's an excitement to the danger when you haven't learned how badly it can hurt you. You have to find those limits on your own. So as Max and I ventured deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of chirping crickets and croaking frogs surrounded us. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine, and I could feel the adrenaline building in my chest. Max was always full of boundless energy and was trotting ahead, his tail wagging like a mile a minute. We followed a winding path that led us to a clearing. The sun had gone down, but the sky was still that dark blue before it gets totally black. You know the type of sky I'm talking about, right? Blue and empty. Right then, the atmosphere shifted, and a cool breeze sent a ripple of goosebumps across my arms. I suddenly couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones out there. Max seemed to sense it too, his ears perking up and his nose twitching as he scanned the darkness. That's when I heard it, a strange growl echoing through the trees. Max's fur bristled, and he took a defensive stance with his tail up, his eyes fixed on the shadows around us. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was then that I saw it, a pair of glowing amber eyes peering at us from the darkness. My heart raced as the creature emerged. It looked like a wolf with wings, not quite a bat and not quite a canine. Its wingspan stretched wide, casting a horrifying shadow on the ground. Its fur-covered body hid the unnatural arrangement of its limbs. Bat wings, a wolf's torso, and limbs that I swear were human. The air seemed to grow colder, and an eerie silence settled over the clearing. Max, usually fearless, whimpered and pressed himself against my leg. I could feel the shivers running through him. The giant bat locked eyes with us, and a screeching howl emanated from its throat. It was a primal sound that froze me in place. I knew we were in deep trouble. With a sudden burst of speed, the bat lunged at us, but somehow I was faster. I grabbed Max's collar and sprinted away, the thundering beats of the creature's wings echoing behind us. The woods became a total maze of shadows, and I could feel the creature closing in. My legs burned with exertion, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. I wasn't going to let my adventure end in tragedy. Not for me, and certainly not for Max. He barked frantically as we zigzagged through the trees, the bat's menacing howls still echoing in the air. The moonlight flickered through the leaves, creating a dizzying play of light and shadow. It felt like a nightmare, and I half expected to wake up any moment. As we neared the edge of the woods, I saw the dilapidated old shed where we stored my father's junk shovels and tools. Desperation fueled my actions and I pulled Max inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The world outside fell silent. The only sound was us breathing and panting like crazy. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, I could see the giant bat circling the shed. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find a way in. Max whimpered beside me, his tail tucked between his legs. I reached down and stroked his fur, trying to reassure him, though my own fear was bubbling just beneath the surface. The minutes stretched into an eternity, and the bat's growls seemed to fade into the background. After about an hour of waiting, I cautiously opened the door and peeked outside. I swung the shovel around a few times for good measure, letting the creature know I meant business. The clearing was empty, though, the giant bat nowhere in sight. Max and I emerged from our hiding place, both of us on edge, but the beast had vanished into the night. We made our way back home, the moon still hanging high in the sky. The rest of the world unaware of the terrifying encounter Max and I had just survived. I tucked Max into his bed, his body still trembling from the ordeal. As I lay in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't escape the feeling that those glowing eyes were still watching, waiting. We had faced something otherworldly that night, a creature that defied explanation. And though the giant bat had disappeared into the shadows, its haunting presence lingered in the depths of the woods. We never went that way again, but I can tell you for certain that I think about it all the time. Casey had always been that guy who craved the kind of stories you couldn't just stumble upon in everyday life. But his office job doing data entry didn't offer much excitement. That's why when he found a new job that would take him near the Everglades, he didn't think twice. He imagined himself immersed in the thick of nature, a stark contrast to the very average life he had been leading in Jacksonville. On one particular lazy afternoon, Casey decided to take his kayak out. It was one of his first purchases when he arrived to the area. That day, the air was thick with the scent of water, and the humidity was high with the forecast of rain. But he didn't mind because this was exactly the life he had been looking for. He'd been around water before, but the Everglades were different for him in a way he couldn't explain. As he paddled through the mangrove tunnels, the slivers of light that managed to penetrate the thick foliage cast interesting patterns on the water, geometric shapes of light and shadow. The only sounds were the water lapping against the kayak and the occasional call of a bird. He didn't notice it at first, the creature, I mean. It wasn't until he entered a clearing of sorts, where the mangroves parted and revealed a larger expanse of water, that he saw it. It was barely a flicker at the edge of his vision, a subtle movement that didn't match the usual rhythm of the swamp. He stopped paddling, and the kayak glided slowly at a snail's pace. His heart was starting to beat faster as he wondered if this was something to be worried about. Then he saw them, the eyes. They were like two fireflies caught in a jar, except they were under the water, part of something larger, something that was very clearly watching him. It moved, and that's when he realized that the eyes were the least strange thing about it. This thing had tendrils, long and willowy, like the roots of a plant, but they were floating above the water. They were trailing behind it as it seemed to slither through the water. It didn't make a splash. It didn't make any sound. It was as if the creature was part of the swamp itself, a silent creature living in the dark, murky waters. At that point, Casey realized he was holding his breath, and the kayak beneath him suddenly felt like a fragile shell that could barely protect him. He imagined being overturned and landing in the water with no chance for escape. The creature moved closer, and he could see it clearer now. It had a form that was hard to describe, shifting in the water, part of it always hidden. It was terrifying beyond measure knowing exactly who was in control, and it wasn't him. He thought about paddling away before it got to him, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He was trapped in a moment that felt like it was stretching into eternity. Then, as silently as it had revealed itself, the creature dove to where he could no longer see it. The tendrils followed, and the last thing he saw was the gentle ripple on the water where it had been. The ripples disturbed the reflection of the trees, distorting the world above until it settled back into a familiar scene. Casey sat there for a long time, so stunned that he couldn't react. He eventually managed to paddle back. The image of the creature burned into his mind. When he reached the shore, the first thing he did was ask the first people he saw about it. It was the people working at the dock, renting out kayaks. They exchanged glances when Casey mentioned what he saw, some with a flicker of recognition. One old man, his face as weathered as the dock he stood on, simply nodded. "You've seen the Guardian," he said, his voice as raspy as the sound of a distant gator. "Some say it's as old as the swamp itself, a spirit of the water. Others say it's just a mutant gator gone rogue. But you've seen it now. So, what do you think?" Casey didn't have an answer, and he didn't sleep much that night, the image of the creature playing on a loop in his mind. He was no stranger to the strange and inexplicable, because that's what he loved. But this was different. This was real, and it demanded more than a casual recounting. In the days that followed, he went back to that same spot in the water, but the creature never showed itself again. Maybe it was just passing through, or maybe it had revealed itself to him for a reason. He couldn't be sure. What he did know was that the Everglades had changed for him. He might have come for a change of scenery, but he got a glimpse into a world that was far more complex and wondrous than he could have ever imagined. And even though he never saw the creature again, he knew it was likely still there, a silent inhabitant of the swamp. Working as a park ranger in Wind Cave National Park is definitely not for everyone. Just ask those city slicker interns who last about as long as a snowball in the Arizona desert. But for me, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It started as a childhood love for nature and ended up being a commitment to keeping the wilderness preserved and protected. The fresh pine air, the jeweled stars on clear nights, even the challenging winter months, they all make it worthwhile to be out here. But I didn't write in to wax poetry about the joys of being a park ranger. No, I have a tale to tell, and it's quite a wild one. It all happened during a routine day at the park. For us rangers, the routine varies day by day. One day, we're out maintaining trails. The next, we are checking campgrounds or making sure our visitors aren't jumping the gorges. But that day was different. It was more of a gut feeling, you know the kind. No proof, but you just know something is off about the situation. Well, you might say my morning went by like a breeze that day. Early patrol of the trails, a light breakfast of coffee and a bagel sandwich, and a casual exchange of banter with some campers. Everything was normal and totally uneventful. By noon, I'd finished my rounds, picked up a few leftover beer cans the campers had so generously donated to the wilderness, and started heading back. There's this one trail. We call it the Ranger's Trudge, because it's our own little shortcut towards the main office. It winds through the dense woods and tall trees, which provide a natural canopy, keeping the trail relatively cool even during the scorching summer. As I journeyed back, a peculiar stench filled the air. It was vile, like spoiled meat left out to bake in the sun. I have a pretty strong stomach thanks to the few grisly scenes we deal with as rangers. And boy, have I smelled some really bad roadkill during my rounds. But this smell, it was worse. Like a mixture of rancidity and decay that only something quite large and quite dead could emit. It made me gag and my eyes water. The possibility of a deceased animal near a major trail was a red flag. So acting like the responsible ranger I am, I decided to investigate. Pinching my nose, I followed the smell off trail into the denser woods. It was strange though. Wind Cave is usually teeming with the scuffles of woodland critters and bird calls, but there was this eerie silence. It was like the very woods itself was afraid to breathe. Suddenly, I heard a low sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was a growl, but unlike any growl I'd heard before. I'm familiar with pretty much every noise our resident wildlife species can make, but this was different. It was less of a growl and more of a rumbling grunt. I reached for my sidearm, instantly regretting my decision to leave my rifle in the truck today. I crept silently in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding like a jackhammer, and then I saw it. A hulking, shadowy figure looming amidst the underbrush. It was big, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown, almost black fur. But that's not what froze my blood. Its body, its stature. It was much like a human's. It had broad shoulders, muscular arms, but it was standing upright on hind legs reminiscent of a dog's. I felt a lump forming in my throat as my eyes moved to its face. It had a long, pronounced snout, with whiskers that twitched, seemingly picking up my scent, and a row of sharp yellow teeth glistening in the dusky light. The fur around its snout looked coarse, more gray than brown, and it leered at me with deep-set, glowing yellow eyes. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey, something I had not experienced until that moment. One powerful hand or paw dug into the earth while the other was clamped around what appeared to be a deer carcass, easily explaining the putrid odor. Its snarl broke the silence again, echoing through the silent forest. It reverberated inside my chest like a second heartbeat. Needless to say, there was no effing way I was sticking around for a meet and greet with this thing. I tried to back away slowly, remembering all those survival shows that recommend not showing fear to an animal. A lot easier said than done when you're staring down what I can only describe as a hybrid werewolf. I was almost clear when I trod on a stick. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot. I prayed it didn't spook the creature, but then I heard it howl. The sound of it, I'm sure, will haunt my dreams until my dying day. Pressed by fear, I bolted, zigzagging among the trees, their familiar smell left tainted by that encounter's sourness. Soon I was back on the ranger's trudge, my safe, familiar trail. Strangely, as soon as I re-emerged on the trail, the forest sounds resumed, though they were now overshadowed by my pounding heart. I made it back to the main office, breathing heavily, and hoping I was at least somewhat safe. The sun was setting, casting shadows across the lush woodland, and I found myself yanking all the curtains closed. As I contemplated over the evening's insanity, I couldn't help but grapple with my own fear, disbelief, and my responsibility as a park ranger. Not everyone believed my story, and I can't blame them, but I stood my ground. I rerouted the nearby trails and warned campers of aggressive bears in the area so no one else would run into this thing. The night was restless, but the break of dawn brought some relief. The creature, or the dog man as some locals came to call it, no longer haunted my every thought, but it seared in my memory. I often find myself looking over my shoulder during my patrols. Life in the wild is unpredictable, and we never really know what lurks behind the veil of wilderness. I'm a lighthouse keeper off the coast of Maine, and about a year back, during a particularly violent storm, I had a maritime encounter of a particularly eerie kind. It wasn't something I had ever expected to see, and certainly not anything I could have prepared for. Lighthouses are peculiar beasts. I've worked here for quite a while, and there's a certain homey feeling for me there, but it can get lonely. I've always found them to be a picturesque staple of coastal towns. Got hired on to keep the old lady up and running, and to make sure her beacon shines bright through any storm. The shoreline here is particularly rocky, and in low visibility can be exceedingly dangerous. There was a storm that night that had been brewing for hours. The air was unmistakably heavy with that salty tang that comes before the weather descends. The sky darkened, thunder rumbling in the distance, and the salty sea spray mist hanging in the air. The waves began their vicious dance in the restless wind. I always found storms beautiful. They're just raw power. My old responsibilities had me checking the equipment, stoking the furnace and making sure the lamps were fully oiled and ready to blast their warning signal through whatever nature was about to throw at us. As I climbed the tight spiral staircase, the old structure would creak and moan under the pressure of the battering storm. She was a good, sturdy building, though. I wasn't worried. The rhythmic hum of the rotating Fresnel lens, casting its light over the wrath of the raging sea, was my sole companion in these lonely heights. The waves, savage as they roared and crashed into one another, had an ominous green hue beneath them. I had to look twice. It wasn't something I had ever encountered before, and I couldn't see exactly what was happening beneath the water. The weather was too rough. Nature was king out here. On clearer nights, The ocean is my only neighbor, and it's a quiet, respectful kinship. But during storms like this, the sea seemed to grow, evolve, taking on a menacing persona of its own. Strange noises were carried with the gusts of wind, groans and bellows that sometimes sounded almost, I dare say, alive. It had an otherworldly feel to it. It was in this state of heightened alertness, amidst the sound of pelting rain, violent winds, the old iron lighthouse groaning as it stood its ground against the storm's onslaught, that I started to experience these visions. I don't know what else to call them. I still have difficulty believing what I saw was real. Even with all the myths and legends surrounding the sea, I was dumbfounded. The weather was getting worse. I braced myself against the window and looked out of the rain-beaten glass. I watched the sea as its waves crashed against the rocks below. In between a misty swirl of rain and foam, I saw something strange, something unnatural. The waves arose, swirling into a whirlpool and roaring again. At first, I thought the roars were just the sounds of the angry sea, but now I'm not so sure. The water seemed to transform as a vivid shape rose up from the sea. It was larger than a freight ship. It completely dwarfed its surroundings. I saw a phosphorescent glow, a strange light illuminating this monstrous entity. It was like its skin was glowing. What I thought were giant sea snakes turned out to be the tentacles of what appeared to be a giant squid or octopus. It twisted and twirled amidst the raging waves. Then, the creature rose up even further. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see its eyes. They were large and glowed with the same eerie phosphorescence. They had a hypnotic quality. I don't know if it could see me behind the window of the lighthouse. Logic tells me it couldn't, but as I stared at it, I was sure it was staring right at me. I know this next part is going to sound crazy, but as I was looking into its eyes, there were images, like visions that flooded my brain. The picture I saw was of a ship amid a violent storm, similar to the one happening outside. The ship was swallowed by an eager whirlpool, and its crew lost to the raging sea. And then, in the blink of an eye, it all vanished. The vision evaporated, and the monster was gone. In the following days, I stayed tight-lipped about my vision. Who would I tell? Who could understand? It wasn't until weeks later a news report came out about a ship that went down on that wild, stormy night. I remembered my vision, the ship, the whirlpool, and the beast. It didn't take me long to put two and two together. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. Was it merely stress-induced hallucination, or the tricks of my vivid imagination after spending all that time alone in the lighthouse? Or did I witness something paranormal that night? Still, to this day, every time the weather turns tempestuous and the sea roars beneath my lighthouse, I find myself staring into the storm, awaiting the monster's return. I wonder if anyone out there listening has had a similar experience with a creature like I had, or has some explanation for what I saw that night. I might have just brushed it off as a wandering, tired mind if not for the story of the capsized ship that came out later. But that's my tale, whether you believe it or not. Let me take you back to the time when I was 8 years old and living in a quiet pocket of rural West Virginia. I'm quite a bit older now, but the story that I'm going to share with you is still as crystal clear in my mind as it ever was. It was summer, around late June or early July. The weather was muddy and wet following some heavy rains. Our town wasn't anything special. It was a pretty tight-knit place, though. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone. We lived in a small house off a dirt road near the edge of Sundown Woods. The woods was a vast and lush green paradise by day, but it would take on an eerie persona as the dusk fell. The evening that I'm talking about was no different. As a kid, I had a vivid imagination. There were all sorts of ghost stories and folkloric tales that surrounded the woods. Being 8 years old, I believe most of them were true, and coupled with that eerie feeling in the woods at night, I was convinced there was something out there. My parents would always assure me that it was just my wild thoughts, but I couldn't be swayed, and I turned out to be right. After a long day of playing by the creek and helping my dad around the yard, I was bone tired. I had finished my regular evening routine, a warm bath, dinner with my folks, and then my reading. My mom always made me read a little each day, even though school was out for the summer. I did everything I had to do, and then I bade my folks good night, brushed my teeth, and climbed into my bed. My room was pretty tiny, and to make the most of the space, the bed was pushed up against the window. On nights I couldn't sleep, I would often sit up in bed just staring out the window and imagining all sorts of fantastical stories playing out in the woods outside. My room was on the second floor, and I remember it being hot that night, so I opened my window to let the breeze in. Things were quiet outside. I was in that state of being too tired to move, and yet unable to fall asleep. My body was heavy, and I felt it trying to drift off, but my mind just wouldn't let go. I don't know how long it had been since I climbed into bed, but I remember the stillness of the night was abruptly shattered when I heard a strange rustling outside my window. My eyes sprung open instantly. I looked out of the window and stared into the darkness. It was dark, and my eyes weren't yet adjusted. I fixed my gaze on the woods, waiting for something to appear. Nothing happened for a moment, and I thought it must have been a false alarm, probably an animal or something. We had all sorts of nighttime creatures out there: possums, raccoons, deer, foxes, coyotes. Odds are it was one of them. I was just about to lay back down when I saw a flash of red coming from the trees. It was then that I noticed the outline of a shadow amongst the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as I saw the shadow get larger. A lump formed in my throat, and I found myself frozen in dread. I could have sworn I was trapped in a nightmare. I remember breaking from my frozen state of fear and pressing my little palms to the wooden window frame, trying to see what it was that was out there, but it was just too dark. Now, I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking when I crawled out of my bed that night and slid into my slippers. 8-year-olds aren't exactly known for their logical decision-making, but I still, to this day, cannot believe I did that. But I snuck downstairs and tiptoed into the yard without alerting my parents. There I was able to finally lay my eyes on the creature in the moonlight. It was enormous compared to me. It had to be at least 5 feet, maybe taller. The creature before me had the outline of a human, but there were these 2 massive black wings attached either to its shoulders or to its arms. I couldn't quite see the details. It appeared to either be covered in long hair or feathers. I couldn't tell exactly. I would assume it was feathers just from the presence of wings, but it was too dark to tell. That flash of red I saw from my window, those were its eyes. It didn't have a face, only the red eyes glowing in the blackness. The eyes seemed too large for its head. They were giant, like a bug's eyes. When I realized that I was standing before some kind of monster, my terror returned and I ran back to the house. I went straight to my parents' room. Breathless and in near hysterics, I woke them up and pointed, albeit shakily, towards the window as I told them about my encounter. Of course, when they went to investigate, the creature was gone. They tried to tell me that it was all in my head, that it was just a nightmare. But how could it have been if I was standing outside when I saw it? I know what I saw was real, but I can't blame my parents for not believing me. After all, it does sound like something straight out of a nightmare. My peaceful nights of sitting up in bed and staring out at the forest were gone. I kept that window closed and locked. I checked every night for the creature, but it never showed itself to me again. It's funny. I'd give just about anything to see it again now, just to know that I didn't imagine the whole thing. It was spring of 2014, and I was staying with friends in Salt Lake City for a few days. The weather was fantastic. The roads were clear, and it seemed like the perfect time to stretch my legs and head out on a solo overnight trip to see some great hiking trails. I had never hiked in Utah before, but I was excited to see some of its beautiful forests and trails and to just check out for a few days. I found that there are many websites that gave direction as to where is good to explore, and also some visual imagery books online that provided detailed accounts on certain trails for people who want to explore on their own. This saved me a lot of money and time by planning out the trails for myself. So I drove the 4-hour or so trip south to Dixie National Forest, found a beautiful spot to camp and settled in. The beautiful rock formations made me think I might stay longer than I had intended. It was absolutely gorgeous. An hour or so later, I ventured out and found a nice trailhead with a little bit of everything. Mountains with waterfalls, cliffs, small caves, and forest. I had my backpack ready with plenty of water and snacks, along with a camera and first aid kit. I had never hiked with so many beautiful things to look at. In fact, I was starting to feel overwhelmed on which trail I should take, and wanted to be sure to see all the best stuff. There were not very many people out hiking yet, and after a few hours my mind started playing tricks on me. It seemed like there was always someone in the shadows of every corner. Was this my imagination, or was something else going on? Maybe I just really needed to relax and clear my head. Maybe this weirdness was just detoxing the real world out of my system. Anyway, I stayed alert and just walked forward. I didn't venture off the trail since I did not want to be careless in case there may have been bears or other wild animals lurking around. I was also thinking there might be snakes hiding off the trails, and I'm crazy, stupid scared of those. After about another hour of walking, the sun suddenly went down, and it became very dark. I wasn't used to it getting so dark so fast, since that doesn't seem to happen where I live. And now I found myself where there were no lights anywhere, and I could barely see further than 30 or 40 feet ahead of me. Luckily, I had a headlamp in my pack, and I put it on to see where I was going. I didn't want to admit quite yet that I might not be heading in the direction I needed to be. It wasn't long until I started noticing that the trees around me looked very odd. Their bark looked unusual, and I started to think that they looked like figures swaying in the dark. Their branches also made strange sounds, as if something was moving underneath them. My curiosity, okay, it was really fear, became too overwhelming, so I stopped to take photos of it all with my camera, telling myself it was a really cool photo opportunity. I set the delay on the camera and started taking pictures. I told myself, for documentation purposes. That's when I noticed just how quiet it really was around me. No birds, no crickets, not even the sound of trees blowing in the wind, even though I was clearly watching them move. At this point, I knew there was a good chance I may have been lost, so I wanted to keep looking for the trail markers, hoping to find something I knew. I didn't want to turn back because that was obviously not the right direction. I had packed my hiking sticks with me, so I pulled them out, figuring it would be easy if I just needed to jab something that looked dangerous or out of the ordinary. And right when I got them out and started walking with them, that's when I saw it. The thing was about 10 yards away, and he was staring directly at me, his eyes gleaming back in the reflection of my headlamp. He looked like a dog, with a dog head and dog eyes, but his body was massive compared to his head size. He was probably 7 feet tall and just loomed over everything around. I froze. My head was trying to figure out why this dog would be so big, and then all of a sudden, all of my senses kicked in, and I realized that I was in deep danger. I trembled uncontrollably and couldn't run. That thing was standing on 2 legs and started to walk towards me, slowly, which seems like a good thing, but the confidence in its slow, purposeful walk was the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was so surreal because it walked like a human, while having mostly only dog features from the neck up. But then its arms were so long, and his hands were like dog paws, and they were massive. I had to run. My brain knew that I had to run, but my legs weren't responding. I turned the headlamp towards the trail, and headed as fast as I could down the trail trying to find markers of any kind. Basically, hoping I was headed in the right direction. But the creature followed, and he was breathing heavily behind me, close enough for me to hear it. I was all too aware of his hot breath raging out of his mouth, and my head was pounding, and the blood rushing through it sounded like thunder in my ears. The creature's dog paws hitting the ground was loud too, loud enough that I could tell he was close to me. At one point, I turned around to look and was dumbfounded to see that he was running only on his back legs, just like a human would run. And now I was able to see what he looked like in full view. His eyes were glowing and his mouth was dripping with saliva. His fur was moving as it ran. And then there was the smell. It was all terrifying. And then, in what seemed like a split second, before I could do anything, He was right next to me, almost as if like magic, and he swatted at me, but I dodged away just in time before turning and continuing to run for my life. The thing's dog claws cut through my long-sleeve shirt and barely missed my skin. The thought of getting seriously injured or even killed ran through my mind. It was all too real at this point. I knew I had to get out of there. Fast. Before this thing got another chance at me, since he was obviously very fast, very smart, and very sneaky. I kept running as fast as my legs could move, until the creature finally gave up chasing me. It just totally disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I knew it had given up, or basically decided to stop on its own, because it had already proved to be much faster than I could have ever run. And next, all I was aware of was that I could hear a dog barking in the distance. Was it the creature or someone's pet? Hopefully someone's pet. But the barking seemed to be getting further and further away, with each passing second, so I couldn't figure it out. The truth is that the barking actually made me feel a little bit safer, thinking that maybe it was just a regular pet dog after all. But I still didn't know for sure, so I kept running, hoping to find someone who could help me. And then, just like that, I came across a trail marker that I had never seen before. I studied it for a second, and then realized that it was taking me in the right direction. So, from there on out, I pretty much just followed the markers and eventually made my way back to camp. I can't tell you how this encounter has completely changed my life. It's been over 7 years at this point, and I still won't solo camp or head out on the hiking trails alone. The fear of being alone is so strong for me now. I just hope that someday I can put this trauma behind me and get back to being myself. Even now, that creature runs through my head every time I go out on the trails with friends, and I truly feel like something bad is going to happen, that the thing is always there. Honestly, that encounter still haunts me to this day, like some sort of unreal dream, but very real. I'm scared. I just don't know if I will ever be myself again. On a positive note, I did get a picture of the creature while it was chasing me. I just need to figure out how to get it online. I remember this like it was yesterday, but then again, it wasn't something you would easily forget. The four of us, all childhood friends, had a sort of camping tradition among us. It was me, Kurt, Danny, and Bill. We'd grown up together, but life took us on different paths like it often does. However, we always made sure to reconnect through a yearly camping trip. This particular year, we had gotten a late start. It was around noon, and we found ourselves on the path to Piney Hollows, the picturesque forest spot nestled against the Greenbrier River. It was just a couple of hours outside of Springfield, Illinois. Piney Hollows was one of my favorite places in the world. It was a smattering of oaks, pines, and maples spread as far as the eye could see. It was as tranquil as it could get. No murmurs of city noises, just the steady rhythm of nature. We managed to find a suitable camp spot near the river, where the ground was even, and the trees provided decent cover. While Kurt and Bill wrestled with the tents, Danny and I set off to gather firewood. The job was quick and easy, and so, with an armful of branches, we circled back to our base where the tents were just about set up. Although we all hurled a few insults at each other about how slow the others had been. But it was all just in fun, as we were just boys being boys. As the evening settled in, shadows began skirting around the edges of our tents. Marshmallows were roasted above the fire, and beers were passed around, and the story sharing kicked off. Some stories were hilarious, some nostalgic, some just downright impossible. The night stretched on as we sat there laughing and talking. Now, before I share what happened next, it might be worth recalling that Piney Hollows is known for its tranquility. It's one of those places where you could meditate to the chirping of birds and the whispering of the wind. Not once did we expect, let alone prepare for, what we were about to experience. After all, we were there to enjoy nature, share some laughs, and enjoy each other's company. Underneath the dim light of the camping lanterns, the woods seemed to take on a different hue. What was green and friendly during the day started to appear dark and shadowy. It was well past midnight, and we were still up, talking and joking by the dying fire. Suddenly, out of nowhere was an echoing call. It was a sound none of us recognized. a low-pitched reverberation that seemed to shiver out from the deepest corners of the forest, echoing off the trees surrounding us. It was impossible to pinpoint its location. It wasn't a bird, not any we knew of, and it wasn't the friendly chatter of a fox or the telltale growl of a bear. It was something else. That sound that planted a seed of unease in each of us. I could see it in their faces. The confusion, the surprise, the subtle fear mirrored in my own thoughts. But there we were, 4 childhood friends, in the middle of our camping ground, not knowing the sheer terror awaiting us as the night progressed. We should have left right then, but following the straying sound back to its origin seemed like a good idea at the time. Maybe it was the alcohol, or our collective curiosity, or just plain recklessness, but we decided to seek out whatever was making that noise. We didn't doubt our intuitions. After all, we'd stomped around these woods as kids and knew every creature that trotted, crawled, or flew around. Venturing deeper into the heart of the forest, our steps, drunken whispers, and the rustling of the leaves were the only sounds heard against the still night. Our flashlights swept across the underbrush. The call echoed again, closer this time, a guttural sound that sent shivers spiraling down my spine. It wasn't just fear, it was a sort of primal terror, something you'd feel when you know you're being preyed upon. It happened in the blink of an eye. Unearthly yellow eyes emerged from the darkness. We had found the creature we were looking for. It was grotesque in a way I don't know how to describe. It stood on its hind legs like a human, in a way, but it was anything but. It was some sort of giant lizard about 9 feet tall, with bright yellow eyes. It had the torso similar to a man's, but its face, its damn face, held the terror of a dinosaur, or maybe just a freakishly mutant lizard. Maybe it was the shock, or the booze, or the unbearable terror. But we stood frozen in place, staring at those eyes. The reptilian figure quietly watched us, its gaze shifting from one terrified human to the next. Its muzzle pulled back in a grin, revealing row upon row of sharp teeth, and then it lunged. In that split second, we became 4 panicked boys again. Kurt on the lead, we bolted back towards the campsite, every rustle behind us amplifying our terror. Without a moment's delay, we scrambled into our vehicles, hearts thundering against our ribs, our breaths heavy, and our minds spinning. As we drove off, leaving our equipment behind, I glanced back one last time to catch a glimpse of those glow-in-the-dark eyes in the rearview mirror. Once we reached the realm of civilization, where the city lights were comforting and the streets were familiar, we stopped. Silence hovered over us, as if words had lost their meaning. We looked at each other, acknowledging the disbelief etched on our faces. What had we just encountered? Was it real? A creature from a myth? A figment of our drunken imaginations? But one thing was undeniable. We'd walked in the woods as men on a getaway, on a mission to revisit our childhood adventures, and we walked out the very same woods, with a newfound terror in our lives, a kindred memory unlike any other we'd shared before. So there you have it. That's our story. None of us have entered a forest since. None of us have left the city. Call it PTSD, if you will. We've just given up trying to convince ourselves it was an animal. The image of that creature remains seared into our memories, and the primal fear still haunts our dreams till date. Since then, we took to a new tradition, reunion barbecues in the safety of our backyards, reminiscing our trials, errors, and the sheer terror that Piney Hollows gifted us. This happened some time back, during one of my escapades around Detroit's ruins. I have a fascination for abandoned and derelict spaces that have fallen into ruin. I know it sounds a little strange, but it's becoming a pretty popular hobby. Me personally, I'm an amateur photographer, and there's just something special about these old places that makes for good photos. There was an old factory that I had been to a couple of times. It was massive in size and oozing with history, just waiting to be dredged up. I had my bag loaded with my camera equipment, spare batteries, a flashlight, and some water. I wanted to get there in the evening to catch the light coming through the broken windows. Natural light is always best, at least in my experience. The place had an eerie vibe to it, and I hoped to capture that with my camera. So there I was, standing perched at the door, the rusty broken padlocks all old and battered. The things we do for art, I thought to myself before stepping across the threshold. I won't lie, navigating through the hollow carcass of the factory was creepy. The silence broken only by distant drips of water from the leaking ceiling. The cavernous space was a maze, easy to get turned around. I paused every now and then, snapping pictures of the broken-down machinery and the crumbling structure of the building. Vines had migrated their way inside through broken windows. It was a goldmine for a photographer. I ended up wandering deeper into the factor than I had before. Normally, I stuck around the entrance. The light was easier to work with there, but something called me elsewhere. I can't explain it really. I just felt this pull towards the interior of the building. And, like an idiot, I followed it. It would be a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. I was about to discover that there are far more sinister things in our world than I care to know about. That strange feeling pulled me toward the basement. I went down the empty stairwell, my footfalls echoing through the entire building. It was unsettlingly quiet. When I reached the ground floor, the air seemed charged. It was heavier. The best I can describe it is like that feeling you get when there's static electricity, like you're about to get shocked. I remember turning around a couple of times, trying to find a reason the air around me might feel so strange. And then, out of nowhere, I was hit with the most god-awful smell. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. Vile doesn't even come close to describing it. It was the smell of something long dead and left out to rot. It set off a rush of unease in me. I should have backed out then. I told myself it was probably an animal that died down here. After all, most of the windows in the factory were broken, and animals tend to take advantage of places like this. So I pressed forward, mustering every ounce of bravado I had left. I came to a room that was even more unsettling than anything I had seen in the building so far. Maybe it was the eerie silence, or maybe it was that smell, but something was definitely wrong. It was a smaller space than some of the other expansive rooms in the factory. There was an empty elevator shaft at the far end that just seemed to swallow up the darkness. It was here where I met the beast. I first heard faint whispers floating around me, as if coming from the very walls of the factory. The whispers were followed by light footsteps. I was skeptical. I tried to find some semblance of logic, but there was no one else in here. I scanned the room, but I didn't see anything at first. I had my flashlight out, trying to light as much of the room as I could. In the corner, I saw what I initially mistook as a shadow towering over me. When my flashlight beam hit it directly, I was horrified. It was like nothing I had ever seen before or hoped to see again. The creature darted away into the enveloping darkness, but not before I caught sight of it. It had to have been around 8 to 9 feet tall. It had the body of a deer or an elk. I'm not quite sure. It was skeletal, with rotting skin barely clinging onto its bony frame. I was certain this horrible beast was the source of the smell. Its head was the most terrifying part. It was a bare skull, skinless with no trace of muscle or hide. It had no eyes that I could see, only empty sockets, but there was some kind of light glowing from within. I won't lie to you, I wasn't brave. Despite my curiosity, I ran. I ran all the way up the stairs, and before I knew it, I had burst out of the derelict factory and into the cold night air. The rest of the night was a blur. I somehow made it back to my car and then home, but I don't remember any of it. I couldn't help but replay the chilling encounter over and over in my mind, pinching myself to ensure it wasn't some sleep-deprived hallucination. I put a pause on my abandoned explorations for a while after that, and I certainly don't go out after dark anymore. It's funny. You know, I've heard of these types of creatures living out in the forest and remote wilderness areas, but not here in the city. Hopefully it was just a lone incident, but who knows, maybe they are moving into urban environments too.